correct to the best of your knowledge?
Yes.
I tender that statement, Your Honour.
30.20.
So do you have a copy of that statement in front of you?
Yes.
And you've also brought some documents into the witness box. Do they include the statement of BGD and annexures to that statement?
All the documents that have been supplied to me.
All right. Doctor, I'm going to ask you first about your career history, which you set out to some extent in your statement. You note that you began your career in psychiatry or as a psychiatric nurse in 1963, is that correct? What training had you done for that role?
It was a 3-year course in psychiatric nursing, based at the Lorundle School of Nursing.
And after that, what was your first position?
Well, it would have been working either at Montpark or Lorundle hospitals and then moving out into clinics at a later stage. I can't remember the sequence of all that. I'd have at Montpark or Lorundle hospitals and then moving out into clinics at a later stage. I can't remember the sequence of all that. I'd have to check.
You came to work at Turana in Winlaton in a particular capacity as a psychiatric nurse.
That's correct.
You note in your statement, I'm just finding the years, from 1976 to 1986 you had a role in the Children's Court Clinic.
Yes.
Prior to that time, had you had any specific training in dealing with children and adolescents?
No. I'd finished my BA in psychology and sociology, and I'd just started a 3-year course in child and adolescent psychotherapy. So
I think you note in your statement that so you started this job at the Children's Court Clinic in 1976. In 1979 through to 1981, you did a child and adolescent psychotherapy training program.
That's right, that was at the Austin Hospital.
What did that involve? Was it
child development? We had to, just been going over this, we had to actually do a sort of a fly on the wall situation of sitting observing parents interacting with their children at different stages of life. So we covered development. We covered about various sorts of problems and disorders that develop through child and adolescence. So the whole gamut of normal and disorders.
And how intensive was that training? Every week, every month?
Every week. And there were times, I think, where we would have had several days where we just had a whole block.
Did that give you a particular qualification at the end of the program?
Didn't give a qualification. It was recognised at the time as qualifying you as a child and adolescent psychotherapist. And I, had some sort of piece of paper that says that.
At page 4 of your statement, you set out what your roles and responsibilities were at the Children's Court Clinic. You note that was interviewing and assessing children and adolescents and their families attending children court, on remand, providing children's court reports and consultation to magistrates, etc. What role did you have at Winlaton as part of that clinic?
As I think I said somewhere, each staff member usually had some responsibility for each of the institutions, and my responsibility was to visit there each week to do any assessments that were requested of me, to see any young women for young people, to discuss any in terms of case management meetings. I might be asked to comment about particular people and so on. Senior staff would then sometimes refer someone to me to be seen.
So you had a particular day of the week that you attended on Winlaton, is that right?
Probably, yes, I think so. I don't really recall a particular day, but there would have, usually it was a day, one day a week, yeah.
And after you had done an assessment, you were to provide ongoing case planning and management if that was required?
If that was required, it wasn't always the case. And when I should be saying too, as you're asking me these questions, that I remember chunks of memory. I do have memory issues due to disorders that I have. And I can remember overall memories of particular situations. So I can remember that, yes, I would be sitting in meetings and people would be asking my opinion about people.
All right. So I'll just explore that memory issue to some extent. You've provided the Royal Commission with some documentation which indicates you have some memory issues. Just let me gather that for a moment. What we have is a letter from a Dr. Nicholas Crump, who's a neurologist and neuropsychologist, and it's dated the 9th of February 2012, and he indicates certain difficulties with cognitive functions. Would you like to summarise the issues that you had at that time in your life, in 2012?
In 2011 and 2012, I think it was, I experienced seizures that at the time were considered to be due to medication interactions, and since been told that it could have developed anyway at my age. But that caused, the seizures. I went into, by ambulance into emergency twice, and I have no memory of those actual things apart from waking up in a hospital. And after that, having real problems with memory. I think, to give you an example, my geographical memory was completely shot. I knew normally how to get from home to my son's place in the suburb of Melbourne, and I had to be directed by my wife how to get there because I couldn't remember. Now, I've got some of that back, but in terms of long-term memory, there are just chunks and impressions. I can't say, I have no memory, but I could give you examples of where there are significant things that I've done that I have no memory for.
Well, some things do come back to you. For example, you mentioned to me outside of the Royal Commission that when you heard the name Jennifer Lyons, you thought, oh, Jennifer, I remember her. Correct?
That was because we had worked over a period of 10 years. I think it must have been something like that. So I would have seen her probably weekly over that period of time.
And you're still practising as a clinical psychologist now on a part-time basis?
I just do about 4 or 5 hours a week.
Okay. I note that in March 2012, there was published a 3rd edition of Psychiatric and Mental Health Nursing, and you contributed to Chapter 13 of that book entitled Disorders of Childhood and Adolescence, which was co-authored. So clearly you still have your cognitive functions intact.
But I must say too that there was another book where I'd written a couple of chapters, and I said I can't cope with this because it was not long after my last seizure and I just couldn't organise my mind to do that new edition.
To the best of your ability, you're going to help assist us, and I'll ask you to just indicate where you have an actual memory of an event and where you are able, from the documents, to assist us with what your reasoning process might have been.
Thank you.
And, Your Honour, just before I move on, and Dr Groom has consented to this being done, I tender 2 documents. One is the statement of Dr Nicholas Crump, dated the 9th of February 2012, and an up-to-date letter, 29th of July 2015, from a Dr Chris McCarty, who's a general practitioner, who really just summarises the previous issues.
Exhibit 30.21.
So, Dr Groom, I'll just return to what the Children's Court Clinic was providing in terms of Winlaton.
Yes.
Earlier, when you set out the roles and responsibilities of the Children's Court, you note that all these roles were carried out with minimal supervision, being directly responsible to the psychiatrist superintendent of the Children's Court Clinic.
That's correct.
So, at the time that you started in 1976, you had only 3 years, I think, practice, is that right?
No, that...
Right, my maths is
that
wrong.
would be right.
Excuse me one moment, I'll just double check that.
I'm sure it would go back further than that.
So you started in Ballarat in 1963, so you'd in fact had 13 years.
Ballarat was when I did my general nursing training, so that came after the psych nursing. So I did my psych nursing training for 3 years, then went to do my general training.
Okay. I'll just want to put up the team structure for the Children's Court Clinic. Can I have a document up on the screen which will assist you, I think, Dr Groom, DHS.3026.0004.0150. And I indicate for the benefit of yourself, Doctor, and my learned friends, that will come up on the screen automatically.
Yep.
This comes from Winlaton Youth Training Centre manual, it appears, or policy, that was implemented under Dr Eileen Slack and is dated 1979. The particular document that I'm about to show you is headed Psychiatric Psychological Referrals at Winlaton. DHS 3026.0004.0150. There it is. So do you see that heading, Dr Groom?
I do, yes.
And you'll see that if that's scrolled down for you by the attendants to 4, there's a note there that reads written reports from the clinic staff are submitted to the stenographer at Winlaton for typing and distribution as follows. Number 5 says current arrangements for attendant by clinic members are as follows. Monday, Mr Michael Groom, psychiatric charge nurse. Fits with what you told us earlier, that there was a day of the week when you were attended. Tuesdays, Barbara Halford, clinical psychologist. Wednesdays, Tony Chandrasekhara, psychiatrist, etc. Did the team at that stage consist of yourself, a clinical psychologist and a psychiatrist?
Yes.
Was there anybody else involved in the team?
No.
Okay.
Not at Winlaton, no.
It's, is it fair to say from a review of that you were the most junior, or at least the least qualified of the 3-member team there?
That's fair enough.
So were you to be supervised then by the psychiatrist or psychologist as part of that team?
By the psychiatrist.
So if you had a case then that was particularly difficult to manage or complex, could you refer it up the chain to the psychiatrist?
I'd sit down and consult with them. And it was either Tony Chandrasekhara, who's no longer living.
I'm sorry, Doctor, I'm just having a bit of difficulty
It
here.
was either Dr Chandrasekhara or the psychiatrist superintendent, Heather Manning, who I might sit down with either, depending on availability.
Okay. So in addition to the 3 of you, there was a psychiatrist superintendent, correct?
Yes.
If that document is scrolled down for you, Doctor, to number 10, there's a note there that meetings are held every 3 months approximately between clinic staff and Winlaton medical and senior level staff to examine policies, procedures and any problems affecting psychiatric services at Winlaton. Was that an opportunity for you to discuss complex cases
I really can't remember. I just have a general impression of meetings when cases would be discussed.
And do you have a general memory of discussing more complex cases with the psychiatrist or the superintendent psychiatrist?
Not specifically. I routinely would, because as well as being at Winlaton, I'd be seeing young people who were referred to us from the magistrates at the court, and I'd be discussing those cases with a psychiatrist as well.
When you visited Winlaton weekly, would you attend case meetings?
Yes, I would.
And so that gave you an opportunity to discuss the particular child with their youth officer?
If they were present. Sometimes, as I recall, that sometimes I would visit the, I think they were called sections, to discuss young people in that particular setting. Because sometimes there might be, I think, someone would have a question about a particular person, and it wasn't in terms of an actual referral, it was just a matter of we've got some problems with this kid, what do we do with them? So there's that general sort of involvement in the place.
So do you remember it being a team effort in terms of decision-making around children?
Yes.
And your role was to...
Going back to the documents, that's what it seems like to me, that often... but, I mean, not all recommendations, as I can see, not all recommendations that I made were always followed through on.
But you had a significant role as somebody giving expert psychiatric or psychological advice about how to deal with a child.
Yes.
You do recall, you note in your statement, that you carried out individual or group counselling on occasions, is that right?
Yes, I was, I can't remember where I read it, it was some article somewhere that there was a tattoo removal program that I'd totally forgotten about, and I can remember that as part of that tattoo removal program, I used to run groups where young women could discuss issues around tattoo removal.
So having had your memory triggered, you do now recall being involved in a group program about tattoo removal?
Yes, and now that you mention it, I just remember that I presented a paper at a mental health nurses conference around about that time.
Do you recall being involved in a triad counselling program?
No.
Do you recall Dr. Eileen Slack?
Yes,
as
I
a
do.
superintendent?
Yes, I do.
Did you work closely with her during your time at Winlaton?
Not directly. I mean, we would have talks and discussions. Sometimes she'd be in meetings, but or as I say, sometimes we'd just have corridor conversations, I suppose, or something. And sometimes I think we would have had more formal meetings, but I have no special memory, but I just have a general impression of Eileen Slack.
What is your general impression of her as a superintendent?
Very dynamic sort of woman who came from America, I think, because I remember the American accent, and I think had a lot of experience in youth services and so on in the States, and wanted to introduce some of that to Australia.
Was she somebody who you ever discussed complex cases with?
Oh, I can't really say whether I did or I didn't. I can just remember having had discussions about particular issues, particular young women.
Do you recall that many of the children who you were seeing at Winlaton and Turana were children who'd come from severely deprived backgrounds?
Oh, yeah. I suppose you know, some of them were young offenders and some of them were wards. So there was a whole range of situations.
Well, almost all of them, either whether they were young offenders or wards or both, children who had come from severely deprived backgrounds?
And quite disturbed. And that wasn't just at Turana and Winlaton. I mean, when this case occurred, I see that I'd been working there for 3 years already, and that would involve people that were referred from the court by a magistrate, and a report having to be written and sitting down consulting with the magistrate as to what to do for that young person.
You say when this case occurred, you're referring, of course, to the case of BGD, which
Yes.
we'll discuss shortly.
Yes.
Do you recall that many of the children that you saw had been subjected to severe physical abuse?
Yes.
And
there were so many of these. I just have this impression of just so many similar sorts of cases. Perhaps some were probably worse than others and so on. But I was reminded by someone who contacted me through the social media, who I had recommended that he not return home. And he was returned home, and there was a paedophile neighbour. That was only this year that this person contacted me, and I'd forgotten totally about him. And that was, I think, even later than 79. It was sometime in the 80s.
do you remember finding out that a number of the children who you were seeing to provide care to had been sexually abused?
Well, yes.
Do you remember reports of sexual abuse being made to you by any of the children who you saw?
Well, I think so. It's just this general impression of there having been quite a few who were at risk sexually.
What was the policy during the time you were at Winlaton, or working at Winlaton in the Children's Court Clinic from 76 to 86, about how to deal with reports of child sexual abuse?
Sometimes some of these things were in train before I saw them. I don't know whether there was any general policy, because it puzzles me reading this now that BGD had been through various services and no one had reported the situation, although according to the documents it was known about.
So did you become aware at any stage while you were working there of a particular policy about what you should do if a child disclosed to you that they were being abused sexually?
No, because that was often a decision that was made in case meetings at the time in terms of a particular young person.
But you were a psychiatric nurse effectively fulfilling the role of doing psychological counselling.
Yeah.
And so it would be understandable that in those circumstances a child may disclose to you and not to somebody else that
That's
they were
possible.
being sexually abused.
Yeah.
And do you recall any instance where a child did disclose to you that they were being sexually abused?
I can't recall specifically. No, I'm sorry, I just can't help with that.
And do you recall at any stage being told of what to do in terms of disclosure of abuse, where a report should be made?
Not specifically, I can't.
I'm going to ask you now specifically about BGD. You've had the opportunity to read her statement and the annexures attached to her statement.
Yes.
Did you also listen to her evidence that she gave yesterday?
Yes, most of it, yes.
And I think you told me outside the Royal Commission that although you have read through that material, it did not trigger a specific memory about her as a child?
No.
And that may be related to your condition that you've told us earlier?
Yeah.
Or it may just be the passage of time, is that right?
It could be a passage of time. Watching some of the other witnesses, they had problems with memory too, and they didn't have any of the issues that I've got neurologically, as far as I know. But I can't remember, and there are things that have happened in my personal life that I don't, you know, I can look at photos of them, it just doesn't register any specific memory.
Okay. Dr. Groom, you agree from a review of the documents that you played a significant role in BGD's life in 1970?
Specific memory.
Okay. Dr. Groom, you agree from a review of the documents that you played a significant role in BGD's life in 1979?
It would seem so.
Can I ask you to have a look at a document which is BGD 10, and that can come up on the screen, DHS.3002.323.0276_E_R. I'm about to show you a request for psychological psychiatric assessment with a handwritten note that says, "For Michael Groom, 20th of April 1979.
Yes.
Are you familiar with this type of document, which is the request for psychological psychiatric assessment?
Well, I probably was at the time. It follows a similar format to a lot of requests and referrals.
There's a note that the referral comes from Jenny Lyons. Is that your handwriting, though, Dr. Groom?
No.
It notes there, BGD presents as nervous and uptight. She's very verbal about her problems with her family, talks about sexual relationship with her father. And then under the word other, at the bottom of the page, notes she has indulged in physically self-destructive behaviour, e.g. on one occasion she scarred her wrists with a piece of wire and talks of suicide often. And then there's a note about the tragedy of her brother drowning, which she witnessed.
I think that might say incestual relationship rather than sexual relationship.
Oh, thank you, Your Honour. Do you see, I've been corrected by Your Honour quite rightly, do you see under 1 it actually reads BGD talks about incestual relationship with her father?
Yeah.
Can you tell the Commission whether or not, reading this document, it would have occurred to you that this was a particularly complex case compared to other children that you were dealing with?
Yes, but all I can say about that is that there were similar situations that young women and young men were in.
So this is a case that you would have felt equipped to deal with?
Yes, in consultation with my consulting psychiatrists.
When would you have consulted with the psychiatrist?
When I would have returned back to the clinic, I guess, at some stage after visiting Winlaton.
Would a note have been taken of your interactions with a psychiatrist about this patient, client?
I'm not sure about that. I don't believe so.
And you have no memory now of speaking to your psychiatrist, consultant psychiatrist, about this child?
Not specifically. I just have this memory of sitting down, talking to a psychiatrist several times, many times.
About different children?
Yes.
Was there a programmed time when that would take place each week?
No, because that varied in terms of availability.
Is this particular case one that you believe you would have discussed with a psychiatrist?
That's very hard to say, but I would have assumed that routinely I would have. I can't imagine not, because of the seriousness of this situation.
Were you aware of any particular policy in the department that guided when you were to make a further referral about child sexual abuse?
Within the Department of Community Welfare Services?
In the department or to police or to anybody else, when you were to escalate an allegation of child sexual abuse?
No, I can't recall anything about that. That was, I personally was concerned about those situations.
At that time, the reference is to an incestual relationship with her father. You would have been aware in 1979 that incest was a crime?
Yes.
Did you view it as the crime of a rape of a child by a father?
Yes.
did you view that crime as any less serious than a rape by somebody outside the family, not taken to the police for follow-up?
Because this had already been widely known within the Department of Community Welfare Services that this young lady was in this situation. And I would have thought something would have been done about it before then.
Did you ever check?
I can't say that I did or I didn't. I would have thought that such an issue as this would have been discussed.
Would you have thought that an issue like this, where a father was raping their child, would have been taken to the police for investigation?
I would have thought so, for goodness sake. There was looking at the notes, there was a situation where BGD was at home with her mother and her partner at the time was sexually molesting her at the time, and he was charged.
And you would have thought, wouldn't you, that the same thing would happen when her own father was raping her?
Would have thought so.
When you were reviewing a child and going to provide ongoing care, would it be your practice, would it have been your practice in 1979 to review whatever available case notes there were for the child?
Yes, and I think in one of the reports, as I recall, my notes in terms of the initial referral, I said that I'd checked and found out the records of the father and his hospitalisation.
Okay. So at some stage, either before or while you were seeing BGD, you would have become aware that the father had been in a psychiatric institution?
Yes, and his diagnosis as well.
That would have given you an understanding that the father was an unstable and therefore potentially dangerous man?
Yes, and as far as I can recall, and I'm trying to find what I've written, I've said that, and I think in some of the review action sheets and so on, my concerns about that have been noted.
Okay. I'm confident that we'll come to that, Dr. Groom, as I move through the documents. But can I ask you to have a look at BGD 11?
Sorry, before you leave that document, could I just ask that it be taken to page 2? Dr. Groom, I know this isn't your handwriting, or you've said it isn't your handwriting. If you look at item 3, it says, please indicate the strengths, competencies and interests of the girl. And in the second line, it remarks she's a physically attractive girl. Why would anyone put that in a clinical request for psychiatric assessment?
I don't know. I've repeated that, I see, in my own report that I wrote when I saw this young lady, Your Honour.
Does it indicate a mentality towards a victim of these crimes?
I suppose you could say that, yes. That could have been, I suppose, saying that then she was therefore responsible, or is that what you're implying?
Well, that has been implied to us in evidence or stated in evidence by BGD, that she was often given the view that she was to blame for her terrible predicament. This seems to indicate that sort of mentality in those who had the care of her.
Yes, I can't dispute that, but on the other hand, sometimes people write general observations of people in their reports. So, yes, physically attractive does seem to imply something, looking at it from 2015.
But professionally speaking, as a person with a great deal of experience now, you wouldn't regard it as clinically relevant, would you?
I wouldn't write something like that. Now.
Just following on from that, Dr. Groom, are you able to assist the Commission to understand whether or not there was a view amongst practitioners in 1979 that children who were the victims of incest, teenage girls, may be somehow provocateurs or responsible?
I think there was a general impression in the community then, and that often some clinicians would reflect the same attitude in the community. I didn't personally feel that way, but I'm sure a lot of people might have seen it that way.
Did some of your colleagues see it that way? Psychiatric nurses, psychologists, psychiatrists?
No, I don't believe so.
Can you have a look at the document that appears at BGD 11, which is headed Winlaton Classification Personal Report Sheet. It's dated the 8th of May 1979. It relates to BGD. The question I have for you is this document one that you would have seen as part of your review of children?
Well, I've got a copy of that, and I think I could have seen most of those documents that were written by young ladies, young women, because there were times when I would have seen quite a few of those.
Okay, so these were documents that were filled out by the child. They're obviously important documents that record what's going on for the child, what the child's most serious problem is. They're clearly things that you would have been interested in as a psychiatric nurse. And is it your evidence that these were put on the child's file and then available for you to read?
Yes. Well, sometimes they were just in my file for me to then read. So, cool.
And do you recall children sometimes writing you letters?
Well, I've got something here that BGD wrote.
If I show you that now, then it's BGD 12 for the record DHS.3002.323.0286_E_R. It begins, Dear Michael Groom.
Yeah.
Did that trigger any memory for you?
Not specifically. I'm sorry, I can't help you with that. There have been instances that I think where I would have received notes written by young people.
If you had received this note, just thinking back on your practice in 1979, would that have reinforced in your mind that this was a young child in considerable torment?
Oh, yeah.
And would you have related that torment to what was happening to her in being victimised by her father?
Yes, and the conflict and ambivalence that she was experiencing about wanting to have a relationship with her father, but then fearing it as well.
And do you agree with me that, I withdraw that, back in 1979, at the time you would have seen the child, would it have been your view that it was for the adults to protect her and keep her safe, rather than imposing on her the burden of making a decision about her father?
Yeah.
Was it?
Though I have to add that in some ways you're walking a tight line, because there's also trying to give some sense of empowerment to that young person as well, and trying to encourage them in making some degree of decisions, and yet, because not wanting to be completely overruling them, and trying to encourage them to feel that they were part of the decision-making process.
But the paramount consideration, even in 1979, was about keeping the child safe, wasn't it?
Yes.
And so a child's conflicted desire to continue to see their parents could not be allowed to override that fundamental goal, could it?
No.
And did you in 1979 regard it as part of the trauma she was undergoing that the incestuous relationship with her father, the rape of her by her father, would cause her to feel incredibly torn about her feelings for her father.
Certainly, yes.
And so it was for adults to step in and help her to resolve those feelings.
Yes, and I think a lot of times, looking at my notes, there were times when I said she wasn't, as reading this here, why is it necessary for me to stay here for such a long time? What's wrong with me ringing up my father so I could, the situation and so on. So she was seeing me, according to this, as not allowing her, and that I was the only one who was saying she shouldn't be allowed to.
Is it a fair reading of these documents to say that what you were trying to do was to encourage her to distance herself from her father?
Yes.
You were trying to encourage her to put boundaries between her and her father?
Yes.
And trying to discourage her from seeing her father?
Yes, and I was just reading last night one of my sets of notes where she reported back that she'd had the weekend and he wanted to run away to New South Wales or something, and she'd been able to say no. And I saw that as significant.
At no stage did you recommend that she be prevented from seeing her father. Do you agree?
At times I did. According to my notes, there were times when I said she shouldn't have contact, and this is what this note of hers is saying.
But do you agree that at no stage did you ensure that she did not have access to her father?
Apart from what I recommended, no. And in terms of access to her father, I note that there was a memorandum from Marilyn Minister where she informed me that the day before he had rung to request to see his daughter.
Yes.
And that she had granted permission. And I was rather disappointed, to say the least, that that had happened.
Do you have a recollection of being disappointed that that had happened?
No, but when I was reading that memorandum recently, I felt, to say that, well, I could say I felt quite angry about it. Reading it then, reading it now.
I'll come back to that memorandum. Do you agree that you were the one who had decision-making power as to whether or not BGD could go on weekend leave?
Yes. Well, I don't know about decision-making. I would recommend that something wasn't a good situation, you know, for a young woman to go into.
And you're aware that your recommendations were acted on by them?
They weren't always acted on. I mean, I think this memorandum is an example of, and there are other situations, for example, the one I mentioned before, where I recommended that someone not go home, and they did go home.
Do you accept that your recommendations were at least given some weight in the decision-making process?
Yes.
Who do you think had the ultimate decision-making power as to whether or not BGD saw her father?
I can't say overall who would have had the final say, because it often seems from reading these papers that sometimes it was a senior youth officer, sometimes it was a superintendent or deputy superintendent, sometimes it was me, sometimes it was just a general consensus in a meeting. There just doesn't seem to have been any clear chain of command from what I can see.
And you agree that was problematic?
Yes. Now, that's me reading back into that.
You will have read from these documents that, in fact, BGD's father visited on more than one occasion.
Yes.
Around that period in May and June 1979.
As far as I can work out, yes.
If I can ask you to have a look at BGD 17, which is for the record DHS 3000.323.010.104_E_R. Do you see that's dated the 5th of June 1979?
Yes.
Refers to, on the left-hand column, date of last meeting, 22nd May 1979.
Yes.
Do you know who would have typed up this document?
No, I can't say who that would have been. It probably would be someone in the typist pool.
Do you see under section program there's a note, Warina, CYO, which we take to be Chief Youth Officer, to ask M. Groom about extended weekend leave?
Yeah. Yep.
And then a note, your name appears again at the bottom under Community Placement Action, 6 June 79, M. Groom, case conference at clinic.
Yes.
And the note there, I withdraw that. Would you have read this typed note of the review action sheet?
I can only take it that I would have, because I usually read most of the documents in reference to anybody.
So the note there is father visited, a sensual visit, very close-knit, not normal father-daughter relationship, oblivious to everyone. Father saw Michael Groom. Interview revealed that father clammed up and he did not really want to see Michael Groom, evaded questions, made veiled threats about getting BGD out. If he comes again, Jay Lyons will see him as he saw M. Groom as a rival. BGD has a love-hate relationship with M. Groom and is transferring from her father. She regressed after her father's visit. When you read that as a practitioner in 1979, that would have been absolutely obvious to you that BGD's father was still an ongoing threat to her, wouldn't it?
Yes, because, and I've just been reading again my own handwritten notes where we discussed that. I discussed that with her and the fears that she had about him.
If you turn then to one of those notes at BGD 18, this is dated the 30th of May 1979. That's your handwriting, sir?
It is.
It notes that BGD is expressing hostility towards me for restricting her movements.
Yes.
I might just get you to read that onto the record if you don't mind.
She also verbalised her ambivalence re her father. I love him. I'm going to keep seeing him no matter what you do, etc., etc. But then expressing a feeling of being unable to feel any individuation from him. I used the analogy of the moth and the flame. She is very defensive about my attempts to interpret a great deal. Dad came to visit her on Sunday and section staff was struck by the sensuousness of their relationship, sensuousness in quotes, of their relationship, not at all like mother and father. She is worried because he is asked to see Jenny Lyons and I today, and whether we will tell him that she has told us of her sexual liaison with him. I told her she will just have to wait and see if we do or don't, but that when I make a promise, I attempt to keep it.
Having read that note, can I ask you, what did you mean by using the analogy of a moth to a flame?
That she found it very hard to want to keep returning to the father.
Doesn't that suggest that in some way you reinforce the message of her being responsible for attracting her father?
I don't see that in that situation, I'm sorry. It just, to me, was trying to say to her back in a different way that this was an irresistible thing for her, that she didn't want to, but on the other hand, she couldn't resist. And I wasn't meaning to imply anything different to that, I wouldn't have thought.
Did you ever say to her, what your father is doing is wrong?
According to the notes I've written, we've discussed how wrong it was.
Would you have told her that it was a crime?
I believe so, because there was times when we discussed about her reporting it to the police and whether, in terms of her grandmother wanting to report to the police.
Did you encourage her to report the abuse to the police?
I did, but she was saying that she didn't want me to do that. She while I was in that session with her, saying that she didn't want me to do that. While I was in that session with her, She also feared that this is the 27th of the 6th. She also feared that grandmother might talk mother into taking legal action against father. She also wanted mother to visit her this weekend. I said I'd